Hello and good day. Today we are discussing Jesus, Anthony of Egypt, and Pontus. Welcome again to RevKevHumanMe. I'm your host, Kevin, or RevKev. On this channel, we explore theological ideas, what it's going to take to overcome our addiction to ourselves, that nasty parasite within our core that we call sin. So we're looking at theology, and theology means the study of God. So here at Human Me, we wrestle with the concepts in the person of God. We are trying to ascertain how God acts and works throughout our lives. So yes, I tell my street students they are all theologians when they actively pursue God, even amidst sorrow and addiction. And I believe it also puts a smile on God's face when we pursue his pleasure. But then again, I also tell the street students, don't add the term theologian to your resume. It likely won't help you find work. On this channel, we study some of the approaches from the ancient people, yes, like Jesus, who displayed the very first step program for us in his unmatched battle of wits and wills against the devil in Mark chapter 1, Matthew 4, and Luke chapter 4. And of course, we have been studying the quirky desert father Pontus, who lived from 345 to 399, and his quest to be one with God. So feel free to go back and check the numerous videos on these topics and more. And before I forget to add that I am hoping to add and to top 200 subscriptions by the time this video is completed. And that is exciting for me, and I give a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's helping to get this message of hope to a hurting world. Let's continue with Pontus. Pontus was influenced by the biblical Jesus, but Pontus was also influenced by a man known as Anthony of Egypt. Anthony of Egypt, he started a rather large religious movement, a movement that grew in fame due to supernatural traction. And by the time Pontus matured, there was already a significant community by the Nile River where Anthony started his work. And I will explain more about the supernatural nature of the movement within this video. Anthony sports many names. You may have heard some of the titles he has been given. Saint Anthony, Anthony Abbot, Anthony the Great, Anthony of the Desert, Anthony of Egypt, whatever you decide to call him, his footprint within the church is well established. Born in Egypt nearly 200 years after the resurrection, Anthony inadvertently established a way of holy living for desert monks. Anthony of Egypt and Pontus represent two different yet connected aspects of early Egyptian monasticism. As mentioned, Anthony is considered to be the very father of desert monasticism. Anthony is credited with founding the ascetic lifestyle in the 3rd century. He lived between 251 and 356 AD. And the story on earth is that Anthony followed Jesus into the desert because he felt so compelled. He was afraid to lose his connection to Jesus, feeling it was the greatest treasure to achieve. Some argue that Anthony went into the desert out of fear of losing his relationship with God. He wanted no other temptation to stand in the way of his connectivity to Jesus. Anthony was destined to seek the Lord in the wilderness, or so he thought. But what of Pontus then? Pontus also followed Christ into the desert after he spent some time in a monastery in Jerusalem. So Pontus wasn't following a man in Anthony, but he was influenced by Anthony. Pontus was following the Christ. Sometimes people do get caught up following men or women. The recently deceased Charlie Kirk is an example. Some follow Charlie Kirk like he's a demigod, but he, Charlie, from a religious standpoint, never directed anyone to follow anyone other than Christ. Seek God. Seek Christ. Follow God and be skeptical of any pastor or teacher. Just words of advice. We should be sifting through any teacher's work. We are looking for truth and credibility, not perfection. No one leads a life that is perfect. Only one person did that, and that's Jesus Christ. Here's a significant difference between the ancient desert monks and Jesus. Jesus was trying to lead the disciples. Maybe it's important for you to get the distinction. Not everyone wants to lead from the front. Some people lead better from the front, and some people are leading from behind, from the back. It's hard to get our heads around these ancient folks. They weren't trying to get attention. They weren't, as we say today, attempting to brand themselves. I know it's hard to believe in this age we live in. People like myself call themselves RevKev, or people called me RevKev, and at some point, I decided to run with it. The ancients went off to the desert to be alone with God, grow in God, and be weaponized by God. They went to be weaponized to prevent demons from entering the towns and villages and cities. These ancient men and women, often called hermits, weren't trying to evangelize the lost. In a barren wasteland, there was like nobody there. And these folks weren't hiding from the world in the wilderness, hermitages either. They went to fight the spiritual forces that we read about, the dominions in Ephesians chapter 6. But listen, there wasn't a social media account for them to get their mass communication out into the church or public square. People just began arriving, following in the footsteps of Anthony, and Anthony felt he was following in the footsteps of Christ. So again, I repeat myself at times, but Anthony of Egypt is considered the first to head out to the desert following the lead of Christ 200 years before him. And Pontus arrived much later. Hermitages and spiritual practice had been developed long before Pontus arrived. So he's building on that foundation. Prior to Pontus, there were hundreds, maybe thousands of people who left the city and village and monasteries, but there was no official roll call. Bueller, 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 for those who remember Ferris Bueller's Day Off. There was no roll call. These extraordinary men and women descended into the wilderness to struggle, to scrounge and gather, even grow their food, all on their own free will. There wasn't anyone pushing them to go, and there was no income to achieve in the wilderness. And Pontus is credited with systemizing the spiritual teachings of the Desert Fathers into a written philosophical framework, what is called the 8 Deadly Thoughts. Pontus's book captured and drew ideas from the Christian culture that Anthony helped create. Many of the desert hermits lived in caves. Some were living in what were called cells, individual cellars dug within the sand. The cells were lined in rows. See the pictures that I provided. There were no RVs. So Pontus was about 9 years old when Anthony passed away, and as mentioned earlier, Anthony left a legacy distinguished by a religious movement. But it was all unintentional. Well, what exactly does that mean? Unintentional. Well, again, Anthony went to the desert to be alone with God, one with God. And the Greek word was theosis. It literally translates to the word deification or divinization. But just because they were ancient people does not make them ignorant. They did not intend to be equal or greater than the one true triune God. They wanted to be full of God, full to the brim of God, so full of God that they didn't exist. And we can hardly fault them for that. And that is theosis. Well, I digress. As we approach the story, here is the miracle, the wonder, the awe, the supernatural, the unexplained. How is it that all these people caught wind of Anthony and wanted to get so close to God that they followed Anthony into the desert? I wouldn't quite call it a fad. These were hard times. Did disciples of Anthony leave leaflets on people's donkeys like people leave leaflets on your car, on your windshields while you shop at the mall? So again, picture this. Anthony is scrounging just to survive in the desert. And as Anthony struggled alone in the desert, a strange phenomenon began to happen. And first pilgrims began to visit him and bring their sufferings to him. And Anthony healed them not by commanding prayers of conquest over illness, but by simple prayers and speaking the name of Christ over them. So that it was clear to everyone that it was not he himself who worked, but the Lord who showed mercy by his means and healed their sufferings, according to St. Athanasius. Athanasius said Anthony tried his best to avoid people in the desert, rejoicing in the contemplation of divine things, but grieving when troubled by many people. But soon others would be desert hermits like him, and they began to gather with him, and he became their abbot. And abbot is derived from the Greek word abba, which means father or daddy. And Anthony became unwittingly the father of the desert hermits, the head and spiritual leader. And St. Athanasius, in his book Confessions, which I confess I've only skimmed briefly, he describes how 2 officials read the story of Anthony of Egypt and were moved immediately to become Christians. People were captivated by the story of God calling St. Anthony in the middle of his ordinary circumstances. So picture along with me in an age long before mass communication was possible, that people came from far away, far and wide, to visit Anthony. Well, how can this be? Well, number one, how did these pilgrims know who he was? And secondly, how to find him? Well, St. Athanasius offered his own reason how people from Spain and into Gaul and into Rome and Africa heard of the man who dwelt hidden in a mountain. It was God who makes his own known everywhere. This had the God factor written all over it. Follow for just a moment the story of God working throughout the New Testament. Jesus, baptized and led by the Holy Spirit into the desert to tackle his foe, the devil, in Mark 1, Matthew 4, and Luke 4. And after Jesus' death and resurrection, the disciples, filled and empowered by the same Holy Spirit, are led into harm, back into the wilderness experience. There would be harm. They would have to flee, but they were not alone. St. Anthony follows that pattern. And not for notoriety's sake, not to create a brand for himself. Anthony wasn't creating content for his YouTube channel. I mean, even I have done that. It has been speculated that Anthony went to the desert compelled. And I'm doubling down what I said earlier. People a lot wiser and smarter than I said that perhaps Anthony went into the desert because he was afraid he might lose God. Well, what does that mean? Anthony's story really picks up after he was orphaned as a young man and was left in charge of his sister. Now, it was not 6 months after the death of his parents, St. Athanasius recounts. Anthony communed with himself and reflected as he walked about how the apostles left all and followed the Savior. And as he was thinking these things, he entered the church and heard the gospel story of the rich young man. In the story, Jesus tells his would-be follower, if you would be perfect, go and sell what you have and give to the poor, and come and follow me, and you shall have treasure in heaven. And Anthony experienced the words as a personal invitation from God, and responded by distributing his property, finding a new caretaker for his sister, and going out into the desert to live in a cave and battle with the devil through fasting and prayer. Anthony's life shows how attractive faithfulness to Christ is. And as Anthony lived alone in the desert, a strange thing began to happen. Pilgrims began to visit him and bring him their sufferings. St. Athanasius wrote, by frequent conversation, Anthony increased the eagerness of those already monks, and he stirred up in most of the rest of the people the love of the discipline. Writes Athanasius, and speedily by the attraction of his words, cells multiplied, and he directed them as their father. In a period of history, long before mass communication was possible, people came from far and wide, and not only to visit. They weren't coming to holiday. St. Athanasius said of the saints, even if they work secretly, even if they wish to remain in obscurity, yet the Lord shows them as lamps to lighten all, that those who hear may thus know that the precepts of God are able to make men prosper, and thus be zealous in their path of virtue. I can go out, live in the desert, and become one with God. Our topic today, episode 38, Pontus, number 4, is on Jesus, Anthony of Egypt, and Pontus. Many of you have seen or read or heard of the poem Footprints, Footprints in the Sand. You've seen Christian posters, you've seen cards about the footprints in the sand. Well, there are different iterations of the Footprints poem, but essentially it's this. If you reviewed your life's walk with Jesus, the markers in your life, which could be represented by footprints on a beach, you would be comforted to know and see that there are two pairs of footprints, side by side in the sand, Jesus and yours. But then you might also notice that at the most difficult moments of your life, there's only one set of footprints. What happened, you asked Jesus? Did you abandon me? And Jesus answered calmly during those marked times in your journey, your times of trial and suffering. He said, where you see only one set of footprints, it was then that I was carrying you. Now hold on to that thought. The version of footprints or footsteps that we hang on the wall can be traced back to various 20th century writers. But the idea behind the Footsteps poem, the two sets of footsteps and one set of footprints, well, it's likely much older. The sentiment probably goes back as far as Anthony of Egypt. St. Athanasius described a lot about Anthony's qualities in his book, The Life of Anthony, where he comments that Anthony of Egypt kept vigil to such an extent that he often continued the whole night without sleep, and this not once but often. To the marvel of others, he ate only once a day after sunset. His food was bread and salt, his drink only water. A mat served him to sleep upon, but for the most part he lay upon the bare ground. The demons gave Anthony no rest, Athanasius said. Changes of form for evil are easy for the devil. So in the night they made such a din that the whole of that place seemed to be shaken by an earthquake. And the demons, as if breaking the four walls of the dwelling, seemed to enter through them, coming in the likeness of beasts and creeping things. The vivid and articulated stories of Anthony's temptation became a common medieval subject in art, the presence of God. You see, Anthony of Egypt found he could count on Jesus, and it was depicted in the art. Well, that is, until he found he couldn't. On one particular night, Jesus was missing, as Anthony wrestled with evil all night long. Finally, after hours, Jesus showed up. The demons suddenly vanished, and the pain of his body straightway ceased. And Anthony was a little unnerved, and he was well miffed. He was miffed with the Lord, and he said, Jesus, where were you? Why did you not appear at the beginning to make my pains to cease? And Jesus said, Anthony, I was here, but I waited to see your fight. Jesus answered, I will always be a helper for you. In a way, this is the opposite of the footprints story, but there is a deep connection. And I believe it was Pope Francis who once said to think of this story of Anthony of Egypt when Jesus seems absent from your life. And then remember, the Lord is close. It can happen that when faced with fresh sorrow or a difficult period, we think we are alone, even after all the time we have spent with the Lord. But in those moments where we feel he may not be there or where he may not intervene immediately, he is walking at our side. See, understand the Lord actually carries us most of our life. He carries us on his back. So the times we see two sets of footprints are the rough patches when Jesus puts us on our own for a short time to remind us just how much we need him. But even then, he is always by our side, as it says in Romans chapter 8, verses 31 and 30 to 33. It says, what then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Who shall bring any charge against God's elect? I know the story of Anthony conjures up my recollections of Job facing off against the devil. But Job wasn't alone. He certainly felt alone as everyone, including his wife and his besties, turned on him, and God was in apparent absentia. Even when Jesus puts us down to walk a little on our own, Jesus is still very much there. Take the example that Job sets before us. God is closer. Jesus is closer, not further away. And I like this Far Side comic. Objects in the mirror appear closer. God is right here. He is not in heaven. He is so close that sometimes we miss him. The early monks, like Pontus, right? There were many nondescript monks, too many to count. No one ever wrote down their names in a registry. These monks, these men and women who followed Anthony into the desert, considered themselves the vanguard of God's army, the last front. And by fasting and performing other ascetic practices, they attempted to attain the same state of spiritual purity and freedom from worldly pursuits that they saw realized in their leader, Anthony. Anthony's spiritual combats with what he envisioned as the forces of evil made his life one long struggle against the devil. And according to St. Athanasius, the devil's assault on Anthony took the form of visions, either seductive or horrible. For example, at times the devil appeared in the guise of a monk, bringing bread during his fast, or in the form of wild beasts or soldiers, sometimes beating the saint and leaving him in a deathly state. In about 305 AD, Anthony reemerged from his retreat to instruct and organize the monastic life of the hermits who were imitating him and who had established themselves nearby. The early monks who followed Anthony into the desert considered themselves the last stand, the vanguard of God's army. And by fasting and performing other spiritual practices, they attempted to gain that same freedom from temptation that materialized in Anthony's life. Anthony's spiritual toe-to-toe combats with what he envisioned as the forces of evil made his life one long struggle. Anthony endured many such attacks, and those who witnessed them were convinced they were real. People wrote down things in their journals that they saw. Every temptation was repelled by Anthony's fervent prayer and spiritual discipline. So exotic were the visions, and so steadfast was Anthony, following the example of Jesus' life of poverty and self-denial and service. So these other monks devoted themselves to poverty, prayer, and work. Believers who chose to go into the desert as hermits were said to be answering the call of Christ. Remember, Jesus said to the rich man, "If you wish to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." Matthew 19, verse 21. I want to reiterate that we don't have to move out to the desert to follow Jesus Christ. My point is this: God doesn't leave his children. We, on the other hand, certainly like to create distance between ourselves and our God. Secondly, Jesus, Anthony, and Pontus happened to go to the desert, but we can create more room or margin for God in our lives, can't we? We can set aside ourselves to be one with God, to learn to be one with God, and that is what this channel is about. Because what's at stake? What's at stake? Well, sin interferes, doesn't it? It interferes with our desire to love God, love ourselves, love our neighbor, and love our world. Till the next time, when we pick up on Pontus and the 8 deadly thoughts, peace be with you.
Now is the best time to start.
Not tomorrow. Not next week.
Not until next month.
Not next year.
You have to start
Right now.
So get out there and chase your dreams. Find adventure. Fall in love. Take risks.
Because trust me,
It'll be worth it, I promise.